Okay, so we are live. So thank you everybody for joining us for our last Rights Club of the academic year. We're going to take a break over August and early September to sort of relax, recuperate, and think about what wonderful speakers we're going to try and get for you in autumn time and in the many months afterwards. So I just want to quickly sort of recap on what we have sort of achieved and where you can look up all the wonderful talks that have happened over the past sort of nearly 18 months now. So we have a wonderful website, rightscience.co.uk, where you can find all information about us and the team members. You can also check out information about the conference that we had in June, but also a sort of mini half-day event as well. Cost of correcting bad science. All those can be found on our YouTube page as well. So this is our YouTube channel, and you can see all of the past rights talks here too for your viewing pleasure. Sorry, my bandwidth is being a little bit slow. So yeah, we've got many videos, and they go all the way back to when we sort of started in sort of January, February last year. So please do check all those out. You can also keep up to date on our Twitter page as well. We do give regular updates, or you can join our mailing list, and so you can join that by just emailing rightscienceclub@kcl.ac.uk as well. So enough about us. Let's talk about our speaker for today. So today we have a speaker who we've been very fortunate to get. Is a wonderful contributor to the sort of open research movement, and that's Dan Quintana. So Dan is sort of a jack of all trades and a master of many, I have to say. And I obviously regularly tune into Everything Hurts podcast with his co-conspirator James Heathers. But Dan is a broad range of research interests, including social behaviour, oxytocin, heart rate variability, and of course meta-analyses as well. And he's based currently in Oslo in Norway. And today he's going to talk about synthetic data, which obviously is a nice equivalent approach to looking at real world data. And it also obviates any issues with data anonymity and other barriers to sort of secondary data analysis and cross-validation. So Dan, if you want to sort of get your slides ready and take away the talk. I see you've got those already, so I can send those live for you now. Yeah, let me just check this. Okay, wonderful. So, okay, Dan, well, thank you again for making time for today, and you can take it away.
Great. Thank you for the kind introduction. I'm really excited to be speaking to all of you today about synthetic data sets and how you can use them to balance reproducible results and participant privacy. Look, I know I am speaking, or I'm preaching to the choir here in terms of whether there is a reproducibility crisis. We know that there is, so the better question is what sort of ways or what sort of tools can we use to improve the situation that we're at? And we know there are a lot of factors which contribute to irreproducible research, one of those being the fact that raw data is not available from the lab, and this is a common problem. And there's a number of benefits and risks when it comes to open data. I mean, open data in itself provides enormous utility for science, for society, and the economy. We know that with open data, we can verify the results of papers. You may have heard it before, but essentially a paper without open data is essentially an advertisement. Once you actually have open data, you're able to verify and take a closer look into the claims that were made in a particular paper. But I think more than that, open data actually provides enormous utility because you can generate new knowledge and you can form new hypotheses. I'm sure we all know that data collection is expensive, takes up a lot of money and takes a lot of time. So by having open data, you potentially save a lot of resources in collecting the same sort of data sets because somebody has already collected it and gone through the trouble of doing that. I think one of the biggest success stories when it comes to open data is the UK Biobank, which is an incredible resource, and so many publications have come out as a result of having this open data set, and it saves other people from actually doing using the same sort of resources to collect these fantastic data sets. So by having this open data as well as verifying results, you can actually go through and generate new knowledge by doing exploratory data and forming new hypotheses. Now, I think over the past few years, exploratory analysis has gotten a bit of a bad rap, but there's no problem with exploratory analysis itself. It's a matter of what you define your analysis is. If you dress up your exploratory analysis as hypothesis-driven, then you have some problems. But essentially, we cannot get to the point where we have hypothesis-driven research without actually having exploratory research. Both of these approaches need to go hand in hand. And by having open data, we're actually you're better able to go into these data sets and do these exploratory analyses to form new hypotheses. But at the same time, you also need to consider participant privacy. I have a lot of conversations with people who are just like very kind of blasé, oh, just make your data open. But these are people who are doing work in psychophysics and reaction times, where there's not that many implications for sharing the data sets. Whereas the sort of research that I do, I work with populations with rare disorders in a relatively small town. So it's quite easy to actually identify participants in a research study if I'm only looking at people with autism who are aged between 20 and 25 who happen to live within Oslo. So that's really the story behind why I've started looking at synthetic data sets. I wanted to scratch my own itch. These are the sort of data sets that I typically work with. They're very difficult to share in terms of privacy. So I wanted to look at whether there are ways of actually sharing these data sets so I can make sure other people can explore data that I do in the future or verify some of the stuff that I do in the future, while at the same time maintaining participant privacy. There's a trade-off when it comes to utility in the use of data and disclosure protection or taking care of the privacy of participants. On the one hand, open data is fantastic. You have very high utility, but there's very little disclosure protection. The risk of people being identified if they don't want to be identified is very high. But at the same time, if you have a closed data set, which is essentially the norm in science, you have very high disclosure protection, but the utility is very, very small. So you have two sides of the coin here. There are a few approaches when it comes to ways that we can actually reduce disclosure risk when sharing data. Most people, when they're sharing data, remove obvious identifiers like names, addresses, and national ID numbers, of course. This reduces the risk, but it is still possible to identify individuals using bits of data that we wouldn't necessarily think we can do to actually identify individuals. Another thing that you can do is you can aggregate sensitive variables. For instance, age is typically a continuous variable, but with age, you can actually identify people quite easily, or it makes it easier to identify people. So instead of making age a continuous variable, you can make it into a categorical variable. So you can do people between the ages of 20 and 30, for instance. So this reduces the risk somewhat, but this is at the expense of utility. So if age was an important covariate or an important variable in your analysis, and then all of a sudden you're converting it into a categorical variable, it becomes difficult to reproduce the results in that case. So you need to consider these things. Another approach is adding random noise to the data set. And by doing that, the idea behind adding random noise is that it makes it more difficult to actually identify participants. But doing this once again reduces the utility because you can't reproduce the analyses, or you can't do exploratory analyses on the data set because you don't know what's real and what's fake. So the question is, can we actually increase utility or increase the use of data sets while maintaining participant privacy? And with synthetic data, you can, because with synthetic data, what you're doing is you can create a new data set which mimics the original data set while still preserving the statistical properties and the relationship between variables. Now, it's one thing to mimic the statistical properties. So for instance, your synthetic data set will have a very similar mean age and variance of age compared to your original data set. And that's fine. And that's fine for reproducing some aspects of the analysis. But when things get a bit difficult is actually looking at the relationship between variables. So if your variables aren't related in the same sort of way, you cannot do exploratory analysis. Synthetic datasets actually allows you to recreate these analyses that both share the same characteristics, but also have the same relationships between variables. So now, looking at synthetic data, you're able to actually place this very, very close to the edge of getting the same sort of utility that you get with an open data set, while still maintaining the protection of participants' privacy, because none of the individuals in the synthetic data set represent a real person. So to give you an idea of what synthetic data looks like, we have two data sets here, the observed data and the synthetic data. We have a number of variables, and as you can see, none of the variables, you have a mix of categorical and continuous variables, and you also have some missing data as well, which synthetic data sets actually handle quite well. So although none of the participants in the blue synthetic data set actually represent a real person, all these variables have the same characteristics as the original when it comes to the distribution of males and females, when it comes to the mean age, and when it comes to income and all these other factors. And the relationships between these variables are the same as well. So with synthetic data, you can reproduce the analysis. So you've done you published your paper, or you're writing up your paper, and instead of referring readers to the original data set, you can say, we have generated a synthetic data set, and here is the code, and you can reproduce very closely. You're not necessarily, you're not necessarily going to get the exact same outcomes. The conclusions are likely to be the same, but the exact outcomes are likely to be slightly different. But that is not the point. The point is a way to reproduce the analysis, so people can actually look through your analysis, and also looking at the way that the data behaves. So, for instance, it's quite common to read a paper and you're like, that's a very impressive correlation, but you look closer and you'll notice that it happens to be driven by one or two outliers. A synthetic data set will also have those outliers in the data as well. So you can take a closer look at how the data looks without necessarily actually having access to the real data. And by doing this, because the relationships between the variables are the same, you can explore the data and generate new hypotheses. Like I mentioned before, collecting data is very expensive and can take a long time. So rather than going to the trouble of collecting data yourself, you can actually explore and generate new hypotheses from data that other people have collected. And the disclosure risk is essentially zero. I say essentially, and I'm hedging here, because there is no way to absolutely guarantee, even though none of the participants in the synthetic data set represent a real individual, there is no way to guarantee that they cannot be identified in the future. Right now, there's no way of doing it, and no one has cracked the code, so to speak, of being able to do this. But we have no way of actually anticipating what sort of stuff we can do in the future. And secondly, there are a few situations when it comes to synthetic data which can slightly increase the risk of whether someone can be identified, which I'm going to go into now. The first is replicated sets of values. Under some circumstances, the synthetic data, so for instance, if you have a really big data set, for instance, a really big data set with a small number of variables, by chance, you can actually replicate someone's real data. And what may happen is that somebody, typically when someone participates in research, it's because they're interested in the research. They may actually go back into the paper, look at the data, and they might not realize that they're dealing with a synthetic data set. And they may look in the data and go, hang on a minute, that's me. That's how old I am. These are my demographic characteristics. Those are my responses. These researchers happen to share my data. So this can happen by chance. And depending on the size of your data set, it's more or less likely to happen. There are ways that you can quickly look to see whether there are replicated values, and you can either you can delete them from your data set if you like. But in my testing, it's either been 0 or 0 to 1% of values are replicated in your synthetic data set. So it's important to actually check whether this is the case or not, and potentially deleting those replicated data sets to reduce the risk of someone looking into the data going, hang on a minute, that's exactly my data. The second situation is extreme individual values. Say, for instance, you have a participant who's really old in your data set, and they're really old by a long way. And if they're 90, if one person in your data set is 90, that outlier is going to be reproduced in your synthetic data set as well. So it's very easy to identify that is that one person because they have that one characteristic there. So there are a few options. You can either remove them from the data set or you can bin those close together. So those are the two conditions where it can become easier to actually identify someone, and the risk of disclosure becomes a little bit higher. So you should be watching out for those. But within the Synthpop package, which I'm going to be talking about soon, it's very easy to actually do this analysis and to get it to identify, has it replicated anything, and looking at whether there are any extreme individual values, which is what you have to watch out for. So the Synthpop package makes this super easy, super cool name. I think it stands for synthetic populations, because originally the Synthpop package was designed to create synthetic data sets for census related data. For census data, you're looking at millions of people with hundreds of variables, and a lot of this information is extremely sensitive, but it's also very interesting for researchers. Say a researcher wants to better understand demographics for education in a particular area. By accessing census data, they can do some really cool analyses, but this data is very sensitive. So a number of different agencies in a lot of countries have been looking at ways of how can we actually create these data sets so people can look and do the analysis without necessarily compromising the privacy of people who have participated in the census. So Synthpop was created with this in mind, but of course it can be applied different sorts of data like I have within the biobehavioural sciences, or any data for that matter. So yeah, the documentation that is there, and it is a really easy package to use. Even if you have basic experience with R, you will be able to use this package. And the workhorse for this package is the syn function, where essentially you just enter in the data set that you want to create the synthetic data set for. Of course, there are a number of options, but the defaults are generally pretty good. And the defaults will give you, in many cases, it'll give you a good synthetic data set. And how it works is it replaces all or some of the data by sampling from an appropriate probability distribution, sort of in the same way like multiple imputation. And it's got one default method, the CART procedure, but there's a number of different defaults you can use. So there's a few different options for creating your synthetic data sets. And sometimes the default won't work that well, so you have to make some tweaks in order to actually get a better quality synthetic data set. But from the very beginning, you should at least try the default because it tends to work quite nicely. When it comes to open data, there are two different types of utility for these open data sets. The first is general utility, which is what I've been talking about a little bit, in that what are the overall similarities in the data set? Can we take this data set, do exploratory analysis, and will this exploratory analysis in the synthetic data set get the same sort of results that we will get if we were doing the same sort of analysis in the open data set? So that's general utility. And the second thing to consider is specific utility. So this is more in regards to reproducibility. Can we reproduce the same analysis that we described in the paper and get the same results as the original data set? So this is analytical reproducibility. So these are the two main considerations for when you're creating your own synthetic data set. Does it have good general utility? Can we explore the data? And does it have good specific utility? Can we reproduce the data that we reported? So for an example, as Sam mentioned earlier, I do a lot of research with the neuropeptide oxytocin. And oxytocin has been known for its potential role, or for its role in social connectedness and how we actually work and how we actually communicate with other people. And there was a paper that came out a few years ago that was looking at the idea, well, okay, oxytocin seems to have a role in human-to-human connection. What about the role between human to a higher being or to a spiritual being? And people did this research. People did this research a couple of years ago, and the data was open. And so I use this as an example of ways that you can use Synthpop. And so here is some of the figures that Synthpop produce. Synthpop produces some nice figures. They're exported as a ggplot object, so you can make them a little bit nicer if you like, if you know your way around ggplot. And here we can see the light blue is the original data, and the dark blue is the synthetic data. And we can see the counts between the oxytocin and placebo conditions, that these were very similar. When it came to the age distributions were very similar between the two, and as well as the measure of spirituality. In this experiment, they simply asked people after getting either oxytocin or placebo, how spiritual would you describe yourself right now? And they also ask a question of religious affiliation. Are you affiliated with any sort of religion? So here we can actually see there is a high degree of general utility, that across these variables of interest, that the synthetic data sets, the distributions were actually quite similar between these two, despite the fact that no single individual in the synthetic data set represented a real individual in the original data set. So to look at specific utility, you need to convert your analysis into a linear model. So one of the main outcomes here was a t-test, for instance. So you just need to actually write the linear model equivalent of a t-test. Now, one of the things that absolutely blew my mind that I only discovered a few years ago is that common statistical tests are simply linear models in disguise. I wish I knew this when I was in undergraduate psychology, because it took me a long time to discover this. But essentially, every single common statistical model, common statistical test is really a linear model in disguise. I'd really encourage you to check out this amazing blog post here. And of course, the slides are going to be posted afterwards. And this demonstrates and shows you and gives you example codes about how these common tests are really linear models. So in this example, I've converted the reported tests into linear models in order to explore specific utility. So we can see here we've actually fitted these models for different research questions, and the dark blue is the coefficients, coefficient estimates, and confidence intervals for the synthetic, from the synthetic data and from the observed data. And here we can see that there's a high degree of overlap for these coefficients. So we're confident that using the synthetic data that we can actually reproduce the analyses that we see in the original data set. Same when it comes to the actual outcomes here. And again, these are this sort of information, or these sort of plots can be easily made within the Synthpop package, and we can confirm that for this particular data set at least, that there is high general utility, that the relationship between the variables or the distribution of the variables is quite similar. And for these research questions, there is also high specific utility in that the coefficients for these regression models are very, very similar. And we can also, and as part of this, we also confirmed that there was no replicated individuals between the two data sets, and there was good general utility. Now, we can do more formal statistical testing of this specific utility. Firstly, we can perform a lack of fit test to compare the overall model. And in this example, there was these models were not significantly different. And you can also specifically test the difference in the coefficient, the regression coefficients, and we can see there's a high degree of overlap between these two things, and there was no difference between these two models there. So this is really impressive that we have a data set created completely from scratch on the basis of original data, and we're able to actually share this data set and recreate the results. And I think this is really cool because quite often I'll be reading a paper and they'll be describing this as the analysis that we did, but it can be very hard to figure out specifically what they did. There are so many ways, unless it's even when it comes to a t-test, it's like, well, was it students' t-test or was it Welch's t-test? There are so many ways to do potential analysis, but if you're sharing a synthetic data alongside the scripts, it's very easy to actually go through and see exactly what the researchers did. And this is, I think this is one of the big benefits of synthetic data. And on top of this, one question that I got from the reviewers when I actually published this paper was, okay, this is great that it works for your data, but what happens when your data is a little bit weird? What happens when you have really, really big data sets? And so I simulated some data looking at the data either had no skew, so it was normally distributed, a little bit of skew or high skew. I also put in and simulated no missing data, some missing data, and a lot of missing data, 5% and 20%. And I looked at different sizes. I think from memory, it was, I did 100, 1,000, and 10,000. And it performed quite well, regardless of these conditions, at least for this data set, that you still do get similar specific utility, regardless of the sort of skew that you get, or regardless of the kind of missing data that you get, which the reality is that's what data is like normally. We have missing data, we have some skew, and we have differences in sample sizes. So it's really encouraging to see that just despite the differences in data that you're going to have, that this method seems to work quite well. As part of this project and writing this primer paper, I put together this analysis, because quite often when you're sharing an analysis, it's dependent on the version of R that you're using and the version of the packages that you're using, and it can be very difficult. It's great that people are sharing analysis scripts, but there's a lot of work in order to get those analysis scripts, to get the data, and to try and reproduce those things. So what I did was using the binder package, which is a fantastic package that hopefully I can link to afterwards. I was able to reproduce the complete environment for this analysis. So it takes all the package versions, the R versions, and puts it in an RStudio container online. And so what you can do is you can actually recreate all the analysis that was described in the paper, and then you can tweak this for your own analysis yourself. So it's a really cool feature, and I'd really encourage you to check out this binder package. And this is something I'm going to be doing for all my papers, or I'm going to try and do this for my papers moving forward, as an easy way to reproduce your data. So scripts are great, but to be able to actually have one click and the whole package with your data pop up in your web browser, this is amazing. I think it's quite a game changer when it comes to how we can actually share our analysis and share our data. Now, of course, it would be better to have open data in the first place. I think as researchers, we tend to be quite averse towards potential danger to participants. And we think that participants don't want their data shared. But when researchers have actually looked into and asked people, do you mind if your data is shared? Of course, if obvious identifying information is removed, people are actually quite into this, and they don't mind if you share their data as long as you get their permission. So I think it's important not to make the assumption that people don't want their data shared. So the ideal thing is at the start of your experiment, or before your experiment, actually get ethical approval to share raw data and get that permission from participants. Participants are more likely, participants are more keen than you would think to actually have their data shared. So don't make that assumption. And of course, it would be better to share the raw data, because the data is that data. So synthetic data can help researchers solve the two most common and valid objections to data sharing. So of course, one that I've been talking about is this idea that we need to respect participant privacy. And if participants want that, that's fine, and that's totally legit. But the second thing, which is a common issue which is raised, is this idea that I don't want to share my data because I have more analyses that I want to do with this data set. I was recently speaking to someone who was in geology, and we were talking about open science and open science practices within geology. And I was talking to him going, well, surely you shouldn't have a problem with open science. Rocks don't have to give their consent to share data about themselves. But this is still a big issue, because people say, well, I don't want to share my data because my graduate students spent a lot of time collecting that, which is totally valid, and they've still got 3 papers to come out of this. So I'm keeping this data and I'm not going to share it with the paper. Synthetic data solves this to a large degree, because essentially what you can do is you can share your synthetic data set, and if people are exploring this, no one is going to publish a paper on a synthetic data set claiming this is the real data. So the only way to actually publish data from a synthetic data set is for someone to do their exploratory data analysis. They can go back to the original data custodians going, hey, I've done some analysis, some exploratory analysis on this data, and I found something really cool. Here is the script. Here is the exact script that I did on this data. Can you do that script on the original data set and see and verify that you found this very thing? And if so, then basically the data custodian can actually go, this is really cool. Let's potentially work together and publish this as an outcome. So I think that helps really counter that one argument going, well, we're not going to share our data because no one's going to be publishing these outcomes purely based on the synthetic data set. So I think that's one real big benefit of this. So altogether, synthetic data provides the utility of open data and all the benefits that we get from open data, while at the same time still maintaining disclosure control, protecting participants. So of course, open data is always better. If we can do it, we should be doing this when we're planning our experiments. getting ethical approval and asking participants whether we can share their anonymized data. That is the ideal, but in many circumstances we can't do that. So synthetic data is much better than no data at all. I do want to talk about some potential limitations. There are some circumstances when you simply cannot generate a synthetic data set that has high specific utility or general utility. I haven't found a data set personally that's done this, but I've spoken to a lot of researchers who have said, hey, I've tried Synthpop and it hasn't worked for me because my data is weird in this particular way. And that happens. And I still think that synthetic data sets that don't necessarily have high general or specific utility still do have utility, because you can use that as a way to demonstrate your analyses. You can actually say in your paper, hey, here is a data set which has some of the same properties as the original data. If you do the analysis, you're not going to get the same outcomes, but at least you can actually see the sort of analyses that we did. So it doesn't always work. Secondly, for now, you can only directly compare linear models. So you need to convert your analyses into linear models. Sometimes that's easy, sometimes that's not. You can still calculate general utility without that, but if you want to actually look at specific utility, then you need to convert your analyses into linear models. But like I said, most common statistical tests are simply linear models in disguise. And in addition, the risk of disclosure can increase under some circumstances. So you need to be careful. By doing the defaults without thinking, you may actually reproduce an individual in the synthetic data set, or you might have some outliers which make individuals easy to identify. So you do need to think carefully about those conditions in which the risk of disclosure can actually increase. So take-home messages for this synthetic data set. With synthetic data, you can improve reproducibility and hypothesis generation by having this. Of course, open data will be better, but with synthetic data, we can better able to share our data sets for data sets that have potentially sensitive information. The disclosure risk is almost essentially nil when it comes to synthetic data sets. So other ways of helping mass participant privacy have either been cracked, as in people have identified it, or they make the analysis is not reproducible because the noise has gotten in the way of reproducibility. So it is an ideal compromise between participant privacy and openness. And finally, this is really easy to implement within Synthpop. You only need a very basic knowledge of R in order to do this for the analysis, and there's fantastic documentation with the paper, and there's also a great Synthpop website which has a whole bunch of lectures by the creators of Synthpop, and a whole bunch of slides and courses there as well. So I'd really encourage you to check this out for your work. So thanks for your attention. Of course, I'm going to be having a Q&A now. If you have any questions afterwards, feel free to email me, contact me on Twitter. These are the kind of issues that I talk about on my podcast as well. And the slide deck is online too. So yes, thank you for your attention.
Wonderful. Thank you very much, Dan, for your really nice introduction to synthetic data sets. So we have a few questions in the Q&A message board already. If people would just keep bringing in their questions and upvote any ones that are currently on the board. Just draw your attention to one that came in, which is to say that there was a link that was broken on the slides. I don't know whether that's something to just have a look at.
Oh, thank you.
Yeah, so they've included the link in the message board. I can send it to you as well. So one question is by Joe, which is what was the name of the package or processing that allows a web browser Jupyter-like scripting for your code and data? So I think you missed that one.
That was called Binder.
Okay, Binder. Yeah.
I can add a link to that.
Yeah. I should add to people who are joining quite late, you can rewind the feed, so it is sort of recorded in real time, so you can pause and rewind. So if there's anything that you want verified or just to confirm, you can go back on that. So we have one question here. Is there any repository of existing synthetic data sets?
Not that I know of. No, not that I know of, because it's relatively new. the process. So I don't know of anything. There might be something out there, but I'm not sure.
I see. Okay. Well, I suppose the next question is sort of related, which is, are there any good authentic data sets that you recommend to use to make synthetic data sets from? So you mentioned the sort of biobank, I guess, which would be a good start.
Yeah. So if this is just in terms of practice, I think your own data is always the best to play with because you know your own data the best. Google dataset search you can find some really good open data sets there. So you can look at your topic of interest, plug it in there, and you can get some great data sets. And you can also look at open data sets on Open Science Framework as well, if you want to practice doing this. And many R packages also have a lot of example data sets built into these packages as well. I believe Synthpop has a few example data sets in there as well if you want to play around with things.
Wonderful. So the next question, let me just get my place. So I wonder how synthetic data deals with the sorts of outliers you get in the real world data. Is this an issue to worry about if outliers are not dealt with adequately?
Yeah, it does pretty well in getting these outliers. So if you have one big outlier in your original data set, the synthetic data set will also have that outlier there. But like I mentioned, this can potentially be an issue for identifying individual participants. But it will catch those outliers there. So of course it's good to run these tests and actually visualize and see, okay, I know this is one outlier there. Was this caught in the synthetic data set? But generally speaking, it's quite good at capturing these things, even though there's some risks.
I see. Oh, and Ben, again, very helpful. This is chap called Ben. So he's given the binder link there in the Q&A as well. The person who asked the question. I have a question as well, Dan, actually, which is, could you imagine a way that sort of synthetic data sets could be gamed in some way? I mean, I'm just trying to think of an unscrupulous researcher. Could they, for example, sort of have a synthetic data set and run all series of kind of analyses and you find the analysis that finds the effect that they like, and then sort of run a study and get the real world data and you know, almost game their chances of getting a significant effect. I don't know whether that's sort of I've thought about it on the spot and it's not thoroughly thought through, but I wonder whether this is kind of an unintended outcome that there could be a consequence of synthetic data sets.
Yeah, it's potentially a problem, but you know, fraud is fraud. That's very clearly fraud, yeah. And it could be possible in theory. You might get a result that is on the border of significance, statistical significance, and then you can run a whole bunch of synthetic data sets and potentially nudge that across. So yeah, that is possible. And but I mean, the important thing to consider is the data needs to come from somewhere. Some people have misunderstood synthetic data sets in that it creates data from nothing, right? So as in they've confused it with like a simulated data set where you put in a set of parameters and you can create data from scratch. With the synthetic data sets, you need to start from somewhere. So the only possible way that you could potentially game this is by running a whole series of potential analyses and getting the results that slightly change. So yeah, that's possible in principle, but hey, that is just outright fraud.
I wonder as well, could synthetic data sets, because they don't obviously map directly onto real world data sets, slight differences, but I wonder, do synthetic data sets point to the quality of the authentic data set as well? So could synthetic data sets be a way to point towards particular limitations in your current data set, or even allow you to detect errors, for example?
It could spot potential outliers. So if your analysis is held together by having one or two outliers, it'll detect that. Other types of fraud could be a little bit trickier, but when it comes to the quality of data, you know, for instance, so outliers for one, if your statistical test has a number of assumptions that is required, by looking at the synthetic data, you can actually go, hang on a minute, in the synthetic data, those assumptions were violated. So I wonder if those, and it's pretty safe to assume that those assumptions would also be violated in the original data set. So you can have a closer look just at the quality of the data in that sense. But at the same time, you always have to check back with the original data custodian and going, hey, I found this thing. What does this mean for the real data set?
Wonderful. That's really quite nice, I think, because it's sort of add an extra incentive, I guess, to do synthetic data sets. So we have a question here from Suzanne. How large a data set and or number of variables can one create?
It is limited by your computing power, as far as I know. I've done it with 10,000, and it took about a couple of minutes on my average laptop. This was originally designed for census data, so it is designed for enormous data sets. Soon I'm going to be looking at ways to recreate certain types of neuroimaging data. And for that, I'll be using the local computing cluster, not my laptop. And so I'll have a better idea of how far we can push this. I've had a quick look at cortical thickness data, a couple of, I think, 10,000 participants and 500 data points, and it did quite well. It still did the analysis, so it seems to be quite robust. And the limit seems to be with computing power. It doesn't seem to break if you're using large data sets. But I'm not sure how far that limit is. But you can do some pretty big data sets.
That's really interesting that you're trying to apply this in neuroimaging. So I know a number of our attendees are from sort of neuroscience, neuroimaging backgrounds. So how could synthetic data sets, you've touched on cortical thickness, but what other applications are there for using synthetic data?
I mean, it really just depends on how your data is structured. So cortical thickness is kind of low-hanging fruit because there's only a certain amount of regions in the brain you can look at cortical thickness. But yeah, if you can get your data set in a way that's in a CSV file, then in principle you should be able to do it. But the first thing I'm trying to do is looking at cortical thickness.
Interesting. Very. I can't wait to see that in the answer. It's something that I think really concerns with neuroimaging. There's all sorts of issues with sensitive information and being able to sort of de-anonymize people from their brain imaging, and that's obviously cited as one of the routine reasons why you can't share data. And I think it's particularly problematic in neuroimaging as opposed to sort of conventional behavior data. So we have a question here, which is there any work in progress for non-linear models?
Not that I'm aware of. Maybe the developers seem quite active, but not that I'm aware of.
I see. There was actually one thing that occurred to me answering Suzanne's question about sort of your computing power. What about sort of the time it's taken you to be sort of fairly competent in doing synthetic data sets? Is it a huge learning curve? Is it sort of an accessible skill set that everybody should have part of their repertoire?
I think actually doing the analysis is quite straightforward. Understanding it, I did quite a fair bit of reading to actually figure out what's happening under the hood, and interpreting it in terms of the different types of utility and interpreting the actual output of the analysis. But doing the analysis is it's a one-line script. It's really straightforward. So anyone with a basic understanding of R should be able to do this.
Okay, well, that's really good. So a question here by Axel. Is there a way for people to create the original data from the synthesized data, e.g. if citing Synthop as the R package used to create the synthesized data, would it be possible to use the algorithm to calculate the original values?
This might be, when you're running Synthpop, if you don't assign it a seed, it'll assign a random seed for you. And from that seed, that's how they calculate, or that's how they perform or create the synthetic data. If you somehow discovered that seed, then there might be a way that you could reverse engineer this. Of course, you can do the analysis without a seed, and that'll never be a problem. The downside of that is you can't reproduce the creation of the synthetic data. But if you were doing this and you wanted to recreate it, then you would create a seed, complicated seed, and put that under lock and key. that is the only way that I can imagine for now that you could somehow, I haven't tried it, but that is the only way that I can imagine that you could possibly reverse engineer an original data set from the synthetic data set.
And what I was going to sort of ask is that my sort of background, sort of by way of context, my background is in language to some degree, and we've done a lot of work on sort of linear mixed models analysis. And one of the, even though it's a more optimal way to analyze data and to sort of cross-check your work, you run into issues with how accepted it is in sort of amongst your peers and trying to get papers published. And I wonder, are there any barriers that you perceive in trying to convince, say, journal editors or peer reviewers that, you know, synthetic data is not just a fancy tool to show off, to show your novel, but rather a really important way to validate your research? Or would you just prefer for people to just take it up as a kind of a personal basis where they can check if their research is reproducible?
I think it's very attractive for editors. I think a lot of editors want, I mean, a lot of people on paper, a lot of editors on paper saying, yes, we want all our people submitting papers to have open data. Whether that's policed is a different story, but on principle, editors want to be able to do this. So if you were to offer going, hey, my data is quite sensitive because of X, Y, Z. However, I have a synthetic data set so that this can be reproduced, then I believe editors will be quite receptive. I know this is quite new. I think there's 3 or 4 papers, at least within the biobehavioural sciences, which have used synthetic data sets. Of course, we don't know the papers that weren't accepted, but in this case, there have been a few examples already that have used Synthpop that have shared these data sets. So I think that an editor will always say, I will take the synthetic data set over no data set whatsoever.
That's really good to know. So I think we have, just check if we have any more questions in chat. I don't see any. Yannick has presented another link for Finder within R. I guess, Dan, I guess my interest is in having done this. What challenges have you faced in actually learning how to create synthetic data sets, and what challenges do you think that most people come across? I think it would be nice maybe to sort of take the perspective of maybe early career researchers who try to incorporate some open research practices in existing research routines. And what are the kind of things that can bring, say, supervisors on side to say that this is a good approach, and what are the kind of slam dunk arguments that you think are quite effective?
That's a great question. I think more and more journals are actually strictly policing this idea of having open data in order to reproduce analyses. So I think this is a good alternative to actually doing that. And if you want to get into those journals, you can say, hey, I can't share it for these obvious reasons, but I do have these synthetic data sets. I think it also, it reflects the sort of norms that we're seeing in research now, where we want to be able to do this. And it's kind of been frustrating in a sense, because you have people talking about sharing open data as if it's very easy, but as someone who works with these sensitive populations, it provides a really good solution, or a really good compromise, so that people who are working with sensitive populations can also participate in having open data. I think those would be the main benefits, and also potentially in getting new collaborations, because once you have this this synthetic data out there, people can look at that data set, and the only way they can actually publish anything is to verify that with the data custodian, which is you. That would never happen if the data wasn't open, but by having this data there, then other people can explore it, and they're more likely to work with you and potentially cite your work. As for the actual challenges for learning, I mean, I guess all these things take time to actually understand what's happening in the sort of analysis that you're doing. But when it comes to the actual analysis itself, it is quite straightforward, even for someone who would be relatively new to R. As long as you're confident with actually importing and exporting data and doing a little bit of work with ggplot, then I think you'll be okay. I don't really consider myself a very strong coder, and I was still able to figure this out myself with a bit of time. So, and the good thing is you can just try it. Try the test data sets within the Synthpop package. Try it with your own data sets. and it's very easy to generate these plots and actually compare the distributions of your open data versus your synthetic data. So I think that's yeah, give it a shot. That's a good way to go.
Wonderful. Well, we have no other questions, and I think that's actually quite a nice note to end on anyway, Dan. So it's thank you again for giving your time today. We will be releasing the slides in the next few days, and the recording will go on our YouTube channel, and we'll put a snippet as well on our Twitter feed too, so direct traffic to our YouTube channel that way. That's it for the Rights Club until summer. We're going to enjoy the summer sun while it lasts, and we'll be back in some time in autumn. So you will be hearing from us from time to time over summer, but until then, enjoy a sort of nice break, I guess, over the summertime. Dan, you can stay on the call. I'll just end the live feed now, and I'll just say goodbye to everyone. See you later. Okay, right.